Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into, well, quite a story. A world of soaring claims, alleged scams, and the dramatic unraveling of a public figure.
Yeah, and we'll be exploring the deep psychological currents that let these kinds of narratives really take hold and, what happens when reality hits.
Exactly. Our subject for this deep dive is the ongoing controversy surrounding public figure David Wilcock. We're talking escalating financial claims, a really insistent victimhood narrative.
And his alleged role in those larger secret space program theories that have been floating around.
Right. And the material for this deep dive, it comes from an extensive transcript of a recent YouTube video. It features a long conversation between the host of The Truth Seeker Show and Clif High.
And Clif High, he has this really unique sort of historical perspective on Wilcock's career and all the associated, let's say, phenomena. It's quite an inside look.
It really is.
Yeah.
So our mission for you, the listener, is to try and extract some core insights here. Insights into information pollution, the psychology of belief, maybe even the anatomy of a grift.
Yeah, hopefully helping you become a bit more discerning in this, world absolutely saturated with information.
Okay, let's jump right in. We're starting with David Wilcock. And right off the bat, Clif High points to what he calls a slow descent into madness. What's the initial spark for that observation from Clif?
Well, what's really fascinating is just the sheer scale of the claims. I mean, right away, the discussion highlights these ludicrous statements, like $1 billion of investment capital supposedly lined up for a company called Sabati.
$1 billion, wow.
And even a claim about spending $1 million to sue the host of that original YouTube video. Just wild numbers being thrown around.
$1 million just for a lawsuit. Okay, and what are the red flags Clif High points out about this company, Sabati?
Yeah, this is where, basic due diligence just flies out the window, according to Clif. He draws on his corporate experience and basically says, nobody's going to give Sabati that kind of money. Why? Because the source points out Sabati has never produced a product for that category in 30 years.
Yeah.
Their only income apparently comes from a garbage dumpster company and from a sewage company.
Garbage and sewage. Not exactly the foundation for $1 billion investment, is it?
Not usually, no. And this is exactly the kind of detail that would raise massive flags for any serious investor. Plus, there's this kicker. A previous investor who gave them $1 million apparently claims it's a Ponzi scheme and an investment scam.
Ponzi scheme claim from a previous investor.
Okay.
Okay, that's pretty damning. So on top of these really dubious investment claims, it sounds like there's also a personal financial struggle happening. Something with the IRS.
Yeah, a big one. If we connect the dots here, Wilcock's claim of having a $1.2 million tax bill, or maybe it's $1.5 million in arrears, that suggests he didn't pay taxes on $4 or $5 million of income.
That's a lot of unpaid tax.
It is. And Clif High specifically notes that at least $1 million or $1.25 million of income apparently went straight to Sabati.
Instead of paying the IRS.
Apparently. It's even rumored, according to the source, that Wilcock's wife left him over this decision, risking this money on Sabati, fantasizing about getting $20 million back rather than dealing with the tax debt.
Wow.
And Clif High just contrasts this with the, rational choice, hire an accountant, a tax attorney, for way less. The IRS will settle, he says. It really paints this picture of a victim narrative being built up.
Like, I'm a victim, give me money.
Essentially, yeah. That's the pattern Clif High identifies.
It's a difficult picture. Now, Clif High also mentions Wilcock has run similar things before, these Ascension is coming soon scams, apparently twice.
Yeah.
Why does he think this third time, maybe centered around Sabati, might be different for Wilcock?
Yeah.
And what's the psychology here?
Well, what's fascinating is this concept Clif brings up, the shock of the new. Apparently, the French identified this back in the 1700s. It describes that dopamine rush we get from novel experiences.
The dopamine hit.
Exactly. Clif argues that Wilcock's audience for the Ascension stuff is much more forgiving. They're used to delays, maybe. But it's the constant escalation needed for the Savati bullshit, as he calls it, that he thinks will ultimately do him in.
Why the constant escalation?
It's about feeding that dopamine need, this constant drive to up the ante and making the story more sensational and more fantastic is required to keep giving the audience that hit, which in turn gives them a calming, comforting sort of feeling.
So it keeps them hooked.
Keeps them hooked, keeps them donating. It's a mechanism you see in the celebrity effect, even in sales. It's about managing attention and expectation through novelty.
So it's not just about making grand claims, but maybe a more methodical approach to keep the audience engaged and, well, financially supportive.
Yeah, it raises that important question. Is it intentional? Clif High suggests Wilcock might even be, tracking responses. Like, oh, I got a $500 donation while I was talking about this, so let me talk about this more.
Tailoring the narrative based on feedback.
Possibly. He posits that each one of those little subject nuggets has to be boosted in terms of its escalation, creating the overall escalation effect. And the source gives examples.
Like what?
Like a minor incident, an animal control officer leaving a card gets inflated into a major swatting event. Or claims of money being stolen from his bank account jump from $4,000 to $7,000. Just constant inflation.
And what about the psychological toll on Wilcock himself, maintaining this constant state of escalation and victimhood?
Well, Cliff speculates that Wilcock is kind of cycling in and believing his own shit, basically. Trapped in this illusionary aspect of his mind.
Believing his own hype.
Something like that. His audience views are apparently dropping, and instead of maybe self-reflection, he attributes it to the deep state shadow banning him, or even dialing in the tornadoes to hit him.
Tornadoes? Seriously?
That's what the source claims he's suggesting. He's painted as this victim for having the IRS on his case, living in a false reality of his own design, which, Cliff argues, unfortunately pollutes all of us.
It's a lot to take in. Let's shift slightly. David Wilcock's been around the UFO scene since the 90s. What's his history there, and how does he connect to this whole secret space program narrative?
Right. Clif High points to Wilcock's long history of, as he puts it, polluting the UFO world with Me Too Mars claims. He does acknowledge Wilcock has charisma. He can learn stuff and regurgitate it.
Right.
But Cliff states flatly, you can't trust his conclusions. The conversation then touches on these Corey Goode depositions, Goode being another central figure in the secret space program story.
Right, I remember that name.
These depositions became public record because of some kind of legal mistake, and the implication from the source, from Cliff's perspective, is pretty stark.
Which is?
That most reasonable people would say David Wilcock knew that these stories were fake and made up. He even mentioned someone named Jay Widner allegedly saying they were just making it all up.
Wow. So that leads to this really strong claim that the whole secret space program narrative, as promoted by them, might have been a deliberate operation. How does the source explain that possibility?
Yeah, this raises the question. Was Wilcock just a useful idiot? The source suggests that whatever intelligence agency put the money into Gaia, that's the streaming platform that heavily featured Wilcock and Goode.
Right.
They did it to pimp Corey Goode's story specifically as juxtaposition to muddy the waters around legitimate investigations like those Catherine Austin Fitts was doing into government finances.
So create a circus to distract from real questions.
That's the theory presented. Make the whole secret space program idea a laughingstock by linking it to reptilians and Goode's Wild 20 and backstory.
The alleged 20-year tour in space.
Exactly. The goal being to stop people asking serious questions about real projects like the military's X-37B orbital vehicle. The source claims funds were eventually cut off when the story kind of unraveled, and also because of Corey Goode's bad personality behavior.
It's a pretty wild theory about intentional muddying of the waters. The source also details some pretty severe personal consequences for people who challenge these narratives, including Clif High himself.
Yeah, if we look at the bigger picture Cliff describes, it's quite disturbing. He talks about facing stalkers, actual physical interactions, mentions losing a tooth, being chased on the beach by two of them in a Jeep, plus relentless online defaming.
That's intense.
He says he started carrying a weapon after that, stating, "You're not going to shut me up." He also points out the irony, this love and light community, and then Corey Goode suing him while Cliff was battling cancer.
Yeah, it's jarring.
And the source adds another layer, suggesting Gaia's board and investors were possibly spooks tainted, implying artificial inflation by intelligence agencies just to push this shit.
Okay, so beyond the alleged financial issues and the secret space program stuff, Wilcock also has this history of claiming to channel entities, right? Prophecies, secret sacred knowledge from angels. What does the source say about that?
Right. What's fascinating here is Wilcock's claim that an angel, an entity named Ra, gave him secret knowledge. He even apparently claimed this entity lied to him first, which is an interesting detail.
Lied to him first, okay.
And then this supposedly secret knowledge was put behind a 333-hurdle paywall. This really raises questions about the nature of these channeling claims, especially, as Cliff points out, because many of the prophecies have just been wrong. They failed the basic test of a prophet.
failing the test of a prophet. Clif High offers a very different perspective on what angels might actually represent, based on his own research, contrasting it sharply with Wilcock's interpretation. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, this is where Cliff really dives deep. Drawing from his study of texts like the Torah, Talmud, various Bibles, he argues that the common sort of normie King James Version Bible understanding that Wilcock operates from is in no way factual to real Bibles. He explains that the Hebrew Elohim, often translated as God, literally means the El who came from the sky, plural. And an angel wasn't necessarily a celestial being in wings. It simply meant a messenger ang, meaning to carry.
So messengers from the sky, essentially.
Exactly. And he argues that these texts, when you look at them literally, depict these angels, especially the fallen angels, as being very much involved in worldly affairs. Into money, they're into liquor, they're into women. They weren't just ethereal.
Not the gentle image many have.
Not at all. He describes Michael the archangel not just as a messenger, but as an enforcer, a leader, a general in a pyramid military structure that led battles. These El beings were bloodthirsty, choosing groups like the Judans as proxies for proxy battle.
A very different, almost military or political interpretation.
Completely different. So Cliff concludes that Wilcock's channeling claims are based on a fundamentally flawed understanding of the very beings he claims to channel.
Okay, let's circle back to Wilcock's personal situation now. The source paints this picture of him living a millionaire's lifestyle while simultaneously claiming to be totally broke. He apparently made $258,000 last year from YouTube, but said it was barely enough to survive. What does Clif High make of that contradiction?
Well, Cliff points to what seems like a significant psychological contradiction. He suggests Wilcock is clearly living well above his means and that this whole victim persona, while maybe profitable for him in terms of donations.
Right, the give me money aspect.
Exactly. But it's also degrading himself every week. He's built himself up as the hero of his own story, amplified by platforms like Gaia, but the source suggests he's operating in a cortisol-dominant stress state, basically chronic stress.
There are physical signs.
Apparently. Cliff mentions observing things like constant sniffing, which he alleges could be cocaine use, and tooth grinding. Wilcock apparently blames the tooth grinding on deep state attacks.
Deep state tooth grinding attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What about the Sabati claims, specifically the aerospace stuff? That sounds particularly unbelievable.
Yeah, this is where Clif High, with his background, really finds it absurd. Wilcock's claiming Sabati will build 10,000 commercial airliners.
10,000.
10,000. When, as Cliff points out, it took Boeing 50 years to make 1,500 747s.
The scale is just completely off.
Sounds impossible.
Cliff explains, aircraft aren't just built on spec, they're built for prepayment. It involves millions of parts from maybe 250,000 subcontractors. It's a massive, complex undertaking.
So Wilcock's claims are just
pie in the sky, as Cliff puts it. Especially galling, he notes, given Wilcock's alleged 180 IQ, but apparent inability to just Google things to see how unrealistic this is. He even apparently attributes simple browser issues to a deep state attack.
Everything is a deep state attack. So given this whole picture, the finances, the claims, the alleged stress, what does Clif High predict happens next for David Wilcock? Does he see this just continuing? Cliff actually makes a specific prediction. He anticipates Wilcock reaching some kind of critical point or a crescendo around the second or third week in July.
A crescendo? Like what?
He expects some kind of an episode, maybe a breakdown or a major event, followed by a period of absence. Cliff calls it a Cosmicon shuffle, where they disappear for a bit.
And then reappear.
And then potentially attempt to pick up on the new storyline. But the difficulty, Cliff notes, is that so much of himself identified with this role, this persona, means he can't admit that he got scammed by Sabati if that's indeed what happened.
Too invested in the narrative.
Exactly. He needs the income, apparently, but Cliff suggests he hates streaming every week because deep down he knows he's lying and constantly has to gin up the energy.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's also this detail about him apparently transferring the deed to his house to a holding company.
Why would he do that?
Cliff speculates it could be a tax evasion attempt, especially given those existing IRS lanes we talked about.
It's a tangled web. But amidst all this, the alleged scams, the psychological stress, Clif High presents a really surprising idea near the end, a potential path to redemption, even for Wilcock and Corey Goode. What is this ultimate con he talks about?
Yeah, it's quite a twist. He brings up this historical anecdote from the 1800s about a very successful con man. After 20 years of grifting, this guy supposedly discovered that the truth wrapped appropriately is the ultimate con.
The truth is the ultimate con. How does that work?
Well, this con man apparently became even more successful by confessing everything. He wrote books on how not to be conned, revealing all his secrets. People ate it up.
That's fascinating. A confession as the final, most profitable act. So how does Cliff see this applying to Wilcock and Good today?
Cliff genuinely seems to believe there's a road to redemption possible for them too, through this model. He suggests they could basically sell how he did it.
Like, come clean.
Exactly. Maybe create a documentary to tell you exactly how the secret space program scam worked and these other scams I've been involved in. Cliff posits that people would eat that shit up. It would be sensational, a huge story.
And potentially lucrative.
Potentially very lucrative. It could even help pay off the IRS, he suggests. The core idea is that there's a road to redemption for all people, and that a full, detailed confession revealing the mechanics of the grift could actually transform their public image and give them a new, maybe even legitimate path forward.
Wow. That's quite a thought redemption through confession of the con itself.
Yeah.
So recapping here, we've really unpacked a lot. The escalating claims, the tangled finances, the potential psychological drivers behind Wilcock's narrative, and the wider implications, all seen through Clif High's rather critical lens.
Yeah, we've seen how that desire for novelty, that dopamine rush, can fuel narrative escalation, how information streams can potentially be polluted strategically, and the really profound, sometimes self-destructive impact of cultivating that public victimhood persona.
And this deep dive, I think, really reveals how our own human psychology, that craving for the new, the comfort of a simple victim story, can be both a powerful motivator for belief, but also a significant vulnerability. It really makes you think, how might understanding these mechanisms change the way you, the listener, process information, especially in those sensationalized corners of the internet?
Absolutely. And the challenge really remains, doesn't it? How do we collectively cultivate a stronger appetite for just the sober, maybe less exciting truth when sensationalism is often so much more, well, instantly rewarding?
It's definitely a question worth continuing to explore, something to mull over in your own deep dives.